introduce Minister Arturo Herrera Gutiérrez, who we've said is the Minister of Finance and Public Credit in Mexico. During his professional career, he has served at the World Bank. He has served in private banking. He served the government of Mexico City, as well as the Ministry of Finance in Mexico. In the World Bank, we know that he led several efforts to improve public management in the Latin American and Caribbean region. And in private banking, he's been involved in a number of investment banking activities. We also know that he is an academic himself, having taught courses on microeconomics and macroeconomics, as well as monetary theory. So, Your Excellency Herrera Gutiérrez, the floor is yours. We'll give you an opportunity to give us your presentation, after which I will expand the invitation and allow both Professor Piketty and yourself to respond to each other's presentations. For now, Minister, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Can you hear me?
Yes, Your Excellency, we can hear you.
Thank you, and thank you for the opportunity for sharing this panel with Thomas Piketty and exchange some ideas. He actually started not as you mentioned, also with a map of inequality in the world, but with a picture of his latest book in English. So let me start in a similar fashion with a picture of his book, but in the Mexican edition. I really enjoyed reading. But let me now move to his map. In the very first map that he presented, when he showed some levels of inequality in the world, Mexico appeared, as he's pointed out, in red color, as appear mostly all of Latin America, and that's not by chance. Latin America, despite being mostly a middle-income region, is the most unequal of all the regions in the world. In fact, Uruguay, which is the less unequal of all the Latin American countries, is most unequal than Turkey, if you want to measure in terms of the euro expanded eurozone. So that's one of the main characteristics of inequality and in the region. And that despite the fact that the Latin American region has been growing relatively robust over the last 30-something years, particularly some countries like Chile, Colombia, and Peru. Now, unfortunately, that has not been the case in Mexico. Mexico has shared the first fact with Latin America of being a very unequal country, but does not share the other fact of Latin America of being growing relatively fast. In fact, the GDP per capita of Mexico since 1982 has been growing at less than 1%, GDP per capita at less than 1% since 1982. So those are typically the most relevant problems that Mexico faced over the last few decades: very unequal and very low growth. Now, it gives me an opportunity and as such, as you may imagine, this is part of what I typically discuss every day, but not always I have a chance to discuss it in a more historical perspective, which is what I would like to do. That since Thomas Piketty's book try to bring this historical perspective, the social perspective, and also issues related to ideology and what he called frontiers and property. And those are, as in many countries, long issues that has been hanging over the way in which policy has been developed in Mexico. I mean, since the colony first and all the way to the revolution, when the main assets, and if you want to talk about income distribution or more wealth distribution, the main asset was land. And it's not surprising that the Mexican Revolution in 1930, it has several aspects to which were motivating it. One was democracy, was ability to elect in free elections the president, but the main important was land redistribution, and in a rather complex way. It was not also about breaking big land owners, but also it was something that was important in terms of property. There was, from going back to the pre-colonial times, a very specific way in which land was owned, which was collective property, which was in the indigenous population it was kind of a common means of production, if you allow me to use that term, and it became a big issue at the beginning of 1910. So there was an agrarian reform, a land redistribution, plus laws that were enacted that protected collective property in what in Mexico was called ejido, which was this property that was owned in the rural south. At the same time, there was a starting large focus to try to increase, I would say, three different kinds of issues. One is what we will now call income distribution. The second one is social mobility. And the third one is to move people out of poverty. And those don't necessarily move in the same direction. People could be moving out of poverty, but if the income goes sufficiently high, you could end up with a worse income distribution. And there were several fronts in which this was worked during I would say, the first half of the 20th century. One, as I said, was what happened in land. The second one were very, very strong efforts to increase public education as a means to increase human capital, also health services. And starting in the late 1930s, early 1940s, was the establishment of a social security system that would provide pensions, etc. Very interesting between the period of the 1920s and our 1940s was also a strong efforts and laws enacted to protect unionization, which as we know, is an important plays an important role when you talk about income distribution. After the 40s, unions were mostly captured, but by the state in one way or the other for a long part. And that's pretty much, I would say, the way in which the country was trying to evolve until 1980s, with one very specific issue. As I said, in the early 1920s, a big chunk of the conversation was about the countryside, but Mexico, as most countries, as it happened with capitalism, start to move towards a country that was mostly rural to a country that became mostly urban. Actually, the breaking point when rural and urban population crossed was 1967. And then we come to the very, very relevant break in 1980, which is a breaking of I would say the economic model and an ideological break. It's also the period of liberalization, etc. And as it has been documented elsewhere by many people, including Thomas Piketty and his team, you start having a move in the opposite direction of income distribution. Now, there's a particular aspects in which this is slightly different in Mexico and Latin America than in the rest of the world, because it's not only a move toward, I would say, more liberalization in the very traditional way and conservative policies, but it also coincides with a period of the debt crisis, an inflation period in Mexico, and the debt crisis leads to a fiscal finance crisis. Now, that actually exacerbates the problem of income distribution, because inflation, one of the consequences of inflation is that salaries, as being slightly more sticky than the rest of the prices, have a much more difficult to catch up. So one of the way in which regressive income phenomena happened was because the salaries were unable to keep their purchasing power in real terms. The second one is that as the debt crisis created a problem in fiscal finances, that became in fact a way to curb the growth in public expenditures. So expenditures in issues related to education, health, etc., which are not only ways to improve human capital, but ways to improve social mobility, were heavily constrained during this during this period. So that's why also we because we have a different story than many other countries, we think that macro stabilization and having stable public finance is not only a matter of large aggregates, of great aggregates, macro, but it's also a precursor to make sure that you could guarantee policies that are prone to have a better income distribution and social mobility. Now, a little bit later, we start with a program which has changed names over time. It was Progreso, Oportunidades, Solidaridad, which is one of the very first programs in conditional cash transfers. And to some extent, that kind of programs were relatively successful, probably not in the long run, in the sense that they wanted to move social mobility, but in the short run in terms of pulling people out of poverty. But as it was shown by Branko Milinovic and also by Tomás, that was probably focusing on the lower end part of the income distribution. So you could look to the elephant-shaped kind of graph that is mentioned by both of these artists in a very, very acute way in Mexico. Now, one additional issue which is extremely relevant in Mexico and may explain some of our challenges moving forward, but also some of the issues that were mentioned by Tomás, and it's related to our macro framework and our fiscal position. As you know, for the last 40 years or something, Mexico has been a very large oil producer. And one of the on the one hand, this is just manna coming out of the sky. But on the other hand, what that means is that we were able to finance, until very recently, large percentage of our budget out of oil resources, as opposed from taxation, which was a very important point that Tomás was mentioning. And I think this goes very much in sync to a view in which I would say the perspectives have been changing over the last few years. Because until very recently, probably over the last, until 10 years, the standard view was that you try to address issues on the social front and on the income distribution front on the expenditure side. You didn't address them from the income side. And the income was just a source to make sure that you were funding whatever you needed on the expenditure side. And now it is proved that the revenue side has two effects. On the one hand, it produces resources to have active policies, but on the other hand, it's also a mechanism to improve income distribution within a country. Now, the fact that we were a very important oil producer means that even now, we only collect less than 14% of GDP on taxes. So what makes us different than other countries is, yes, we have high income inequality like Latin Americas, but with low growth and with very low taxation rates and tax collection. Now that brings us to where we are. What kind of country do we have now? So one of your first charts in your book, but also in your presentation, which is a different way to measure inequalities, to focus on the percentage of the national income that is captured by the top 10%. And probably what you're trying to address with that is this elephant shape, because otherwise the Gini coefficient may not be moving on the same direction. You were showing results that were probably for some countries in the mid 55%. For Mexico, this is 59%. This is one of the highest concentrations in the top 10. In the top 10%. Now, what do we need to do now? Now let me make the problem slightly more broader, because this is one particular specific kind of inequality. When we address the issues of inequality in Mexico, we have to take a broader approach. And let me just give you 3 or 4 numbers. The GDP per capita in Mexico City, which as the country, Mexico City itself is an unequal society, is almost 7 times higher than the GDP per capita in Chiapas. The GDP per capita in the second wealthiest state, Nuevo León, is more than 4 times the GDP per capita of Oaxaca. And in the very old times, there was this hypothesis of the catch-up, in which lower income economies will eventually catch up with higher ones. We have actually a divergence in Mexico. So when we talk about inequality in Mexico, it's not only about inequalities of among social groups or classes, if you want to use an old term, but it's also about regions. And the second one that I want to mention, which is also one of the main differences with respect to our peers, is inequalities in between genders. Just give me one number there. Less than 50% of prime age women in Mexico are in the labor force. So there are cultural issues, etc., but it's very difficult to come that is sufficient to explain why we have a lower female participation than Colombia, than Peru, than Bolivia, than Ecuador, and than El Salvador, right? So these are issues. Now, what we need to do, and as well as Tomás, he because that's where his research is leading me, because I'm a public officer. Let me finish in a slightly more positive note. First of all, I would say these are issues that, for some reason, starting to converge the concerns about them, and the societies were very much in sync to trying to move in a different direction. Clearly, in Mexico, that was one of the cases, and that explains to a large extent why there was a change in the previous national election. Second, although there has been a prevailing increase of inequality across many countries, and people has been showcasing the cases in Western Europe and the US, which are much smaller inequality than the one we have in Latin America and Mexico. People understand that now it's an issue that needs to be addressed, and that it needs to be, and it's better for everybody if it's addressed. Let me just give you an example. We were able to pass a pension reform last fall, in which most of actually all of the increase in the contribution is going to come from the private sector, and it's going to increase the assets under management of the pension fund from 17% to 40%. And this was basically because some of the leading voices in the private sector at the firm levels were understood that it was impossible to keep having a country with this sense of these parties. And my sense is that that's where we were before COVID hits the world and hits everybody, including Mexico. And COVID is a tragedy, and it has effects on many fronts. One is inequality and poverty itself. As many countries, when we imposed a lockdown last year, that displays a very large number of firms, particularly small firms, and workers, and particularly those workers that are unable to work from home. And that's typically people who have jobs on the lower end of the income distribution. I wouldn't be surprised if when the next national survey comes, poverty has increased substantially, and inequality has increased substantially. But COVID has also brought to the surface some issues that were somehow underneath of the national discussion. One obvious is, for example, do we have the health services, public health services that we need? And clearly, as most countries, we have to scale up our health services during COVID. But if we want to make that permanent, that will require us to finance it. And that will require us to reconsider, among other things, where is the money and what's the relevant tax structure associated with it. But also has brought something different, which is this sense of collective responsibility that is needed to address COVID. And that is opening an opportunity to discuss many of these issues. These issues that there are many issues relevant, like a pandemic, that requires the action of everybody involved in a society. It's important, and the fact that you protect others when you protect yourself with many ways, including using a mask, is creating an environment in which many of these issues is possible developing a window to discuss it. So with that note, I'll stop, and with the hope that we will be able, in the post-COVID economy, be able to construct a better world and a more inclusive and more just. Thank you.
Minister Gutierrez, that was an incredible contribution in terms of a keynote. I won't call it a comeback because we're not in the ring. We are about sharing ideas, and I'm mindful of time. So I do want to just maybe acknowledge the usefulness of you giving us a historical lens, speaking to some of the levers from a policy perspective that the government used in order to try and address inequalities as much as possible, but also bringing us to the current frame, talking about the broader approach that Mexico is taking on to understand and measure inequality, and of course, including gender inequality, which is something that hasn't been scaled across the world. And of course, landing on the point of the impact of COVID-19 and how that has had an impact of increasing inequality and increasing poverty. Of course, not leaving out the positive side of that, to say we have come to a point where we are finally having a sense of collective responsibility about how we engage and respond. What I'm going to do now, I'm going to open the floor, and I'm going to allow each of you, and I'm going to ask for a lot of discipline, because I'm going to give you 2 minutes each just to respond to what you have heard. So Thomas, I'm going to give you a chance first. I'm going to ask you, having listened to Minister Gutierrez, in 2 minutes, what are some of the key things that you would like to react to?
Well, first, I've learned a lot, and I would like to ask more questions to Arturo. It's in particular, I'm wondering why, according to you, is Mexico such a low female participation rate, and what should be done, what could be done, and how did it happen, and I get, there are many other questions, but you mentioned the fact that oil revenue sort of prevented, in a way, or did not help historically Mexico to build more tax capacity, and I'm wondering, when did it start being really a key factor, or is the lag in tax capacity building, did it start earlier than oil revenues really became? Because Mexico, in a way, for all of us, is a puzzle that there was this very ambitious attempt, as you mentioned already 1 century ago, to have this ambitious land reform policy, and then building the beginning of a social security system, and it did not quite deliver, including within Latin America, some countries like Argentina, which of course have a very different history, somehow managed to build more inclusiveness in some limited manner, and yeah, I don't know. I would like to continue the discussion forever with you, but the specific difference on female participation that you mentioned, I'd be happy to learn more about this.
Thomas, I think it's a fantastic question, and very smart of you not to react, but to ask a question. So Minister Gutierrez, over to you. How do you respond to this question of the representation of women and how income inequality has played itself out across that gender lens? Minister, if I can ask you to unmute, please. Thank you.
Yeah, sorry. So that's exactly the question that we ask ourselves, because this was a problem that was easier to spot, that understand the causes and the solutions. And because at the beginning we thought it was a cultural issue, right? Latin America, a macho region. But then that didn't explain why we have lower participation rates than Peru, Bolivia, Ecuador, Colombia, and Brazil, right? And it seems that we have a series of causes that are compounding each other. Let me just mention two that we're working on, because once you identify the reason, then you have to move towards try to addressing it. One is the lack of a national system of care. So when you have small kids in a country, or when you have elderly people in families, and as countries are growing, are progressing, lifespan is also is improving, and that's usually it's a good thing. But it's becoming by default that women are the ones who are caring for them. So the one thing that we are doing now is trying to understand how to create a national system, how much it will cost, and how it will and how do we share the finance. We think that eventually will pay by themselves. Let me just give you a number. If we have the participation rate of a country like Argentina, that will include 2 or 3 more million people of women into the labor force. That probably will pay for the system. The second one, which is something that we have to work really strong on, that is that particularly in large metropolitan areas where there's an issue of very large commutes from the outskirts to the job, insecurity plays a role. If somebody has to commute 2 hours in and 2 hours out, that's a lot of time to feel unsafe during the day. And the third one is issues related to, that was a surprise, by the way, for us. We didn't have it in the radar. And the third one is about flexibility. More jobs require to have flexibility for females, because usually, again, they are the default if they have to take care at some issues at home. Now, the digital economy is opening an opportunity right there. But the fact there's an opportunity doesn't mean that there's a solution. What we are finding is that we have to train them to be able to do that. And we actually finished a program over the last few months of how to retrain women to insert themselves in the digital economy, and we expect to scale it up soon. I'll probably stop there.
Minister Gutierrez, I think it's a fantastic answer. The care economy keeps coming up in these conversations around inequality, and it's really interesting to see how your government is looking at this economy. Insecurity across transport infrastructure is real for women around the world, and that's an interesting insight that you've lifted there. And of course, the opportunity for flexibility as we're looking at new ways of working coming to the surface. Now, Minister, I don't know whether you're going to be as cheeky as Mr. Piketty and ask a question yourself, or you're going to take the opportunity to react. You've got 2 minutes. That's what I'm going to give you. It's totally up to you.
No, I mean, there are 2 obvious things that are relevant, and one is, and let me start where I finished in my answer, when you have the issues related to the digital economy. The digital economy is raising 2 very obvious challenges in the world. One is becoming a larger and larger share of the GDP. So it's growing faster than other sectors. But on the other hand, is much more difficult to tax. For example, in the very old days, when all the intellectuals were in Mexico City and they were reading the New York Times or Le Monde, they basically have to buy it in a special store here, and they have to pay taxes here. Now, if they want to read those 2 papers, they subscribe online and they pay taxes in the US or in France. And this, in fact, has been the much more contentious problem among, I would say, or discussion among G20 countries, where there was basically an agreement by 19 out of the 20 to reach this idea of having a basic world tax on that. And there was one holdout, which was the US in the previous administration. Janet Yellen just mentioned that they are willing to move along. And that's probably in terms of both taxation, which was an issue raised by Thomas, in terms of global inequality, extremely important. I wonder how optimistic does he feel that this will be able to land to land properly.
Okay, I see what you've done there. So you've not only responded to the question, but you've asked the question as well. Thomas, I'm going to give you 30 seconds I mean, Minister, you know, as I give the baton over to Thomas for one last time, I must say you hit one of the central questions that had come from our global audience. And so, Thomas, maybe you can react to this as well. And the question was about how do we ensure that there is more effective taxation of the digital economy, but more importantly, what is your expectation of OECD countries and their plan in this regard? What could they do better when it comes to this particular issue? So you've got 30 seconds. I'll be lenient and make a minute, Thomas, but that's the final contribution.
Okay, well, I am more optimistic than, you know, under Trump, but you know, I am less optimistic than if we had a different European governance system. I think the fact that we still are under unanimity rule for tax decision in Europe, you know, it's a big limitation to the role that Europe could play in moving toward a more equitable tax system globally. Because in the end, at the end of the day, Europe is unable to make decision. You know, we complain all the time about, you know, Trump, and we will complain about Biden as well. But the truth is that we are not playing, you know, our role, because each individual country can put a veto, and so we actually never take a decision about corporate taxation. Look, maybe some things will happen at OECD, but in any case, it will be much less than what could happen if we had majority rule decision making and tax issues, which more you know, parliamentary deliberation and decision. And you know, I've been, as you mentioned at the beginning, I've been one of the author of this manifesto for the democratization of Europe, which proposes to put you know, tax issues you know, in the competence of a European Assembly using national parliament members, and not only the current European Parliament, because tax issues are, you know, are really the domain of national parliaments. So anyway, there would be a lot more to say, but you know, as long as Europe is not fully on board on these issues, I'm afraid there will be limited progress in international cooperation.
Fantastic. Thank you very much, Thomas. So unless Europe is on board, and of course that speaks to the theme that the minister did raise earlier on, saying in Mexico there's a sense of collective responsibility. And what I'm hearing you saying, Thomas, is maybe that is what's missing from the global conversation, is that sense of collective responsibility and collective ownership. I'm going to give the minister the final word on this, because as we talk about the OECD and the gap that we are highlighting in terms of them really stepping up to leadership in this particular space, we know that Mexico sits within that grouping. So maybe, Minister, a final word from you before we wrap up this piece.
Yeah, no, thank you. I would probably say that as we start moving out of the pandemic, we cannot make of this kind of an impasse, a large impasse, and going back to the world that we have in 2019. We should take this very painful opportunity to build it better, and that includes addressing issues of income inequality, gender, trade, which we didn't talk about it, and of course climate change. Those were issues that were extremely relevant before COVID hit the world. They are even more relevant now, but we should take the opportunity that we are addressing this major issue together to try to build upon for